Good evening, everybody. I am Jen DeRosa. I'm the Program Coordinator for Environmental Sciences and Policy and Energy Policy and Climate. And welcome to our Energy and Environmental Program Speaker Series. Our topic discussion today is the coal bailout nobody is talking about. And our speaker today is Joe Daniel. He's a senior energy analyst with the Climate and Energy Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. His work helps to advance science-based public policy around renewable energy at the state and regional levels. And he also leads research and advocacy efforts to shape electricity markets and policies to develop a more flexible and modern electric grid that can accommodate high levels of renewable energy, demand-side resources, and electric vehicles, while also reducing carbon emissions and reliance on fossil fuels. Now, Joe also began his career in 2005 modeling energy use and fugitive emissions at a petrochemical facility outside Mobile, Alabama. He's also worked as an engineering consultant in more than 30 oil refineries, natural gas facilities, and power plants. And since 2011, his work has focused on the electric utility industry.
Thanks, Jen. I'm Joe Daniel. I'm a senior energy analyst at the Union of Concerned Scientists Climate and Energy Program. And today we're going to talk about what we've described as the coal bailout nobody is talking about. It explores how electric utility companies are exploiting loopholes that deprive customers of lower cost, cleaner electricity. And just to give a quick roadmap of what I'd like to discuss today, we're going to start off with a very brief introduction on the Union of Concerned Scientists, what it is that we do and what specifically I do at the organization. And then we'll do an overview of coal-fired power plant operations and economics, the wholesale power markets, and then we'll really dig into the analysis that I've been conducting along with my team for the past few years. And one of the things that is at the center of what UCS does is we apply our research and analytical rigor to advocacy and into campaigns. So we want to affect change and affect policy. So we'll talk a little bit about how we plan on taking this objective research and then applying it to the campaigns and applying it to the real world and to legislative and regulatory settings. So a little bit about UCS. UCS was found 51 years ago, I should update this slide, by scientists and students and academics at MIT who felt like the public policy and legislative processes weren't being properly informed by science and by objective research. And so they were particularly disturbed by the militarization of scientific research, but also about the lack of voice that scientists had on Capitol Hill. We now have 4 offices, one in Cambridge, here in DC, Chicago, and Oakland. And we work on a variety of issues from agriculture to anti-proliferation to climate and energy, and do scientific research with this intent to address global problems and improve people's lives. We are about 250 scientists, analysts, policy experts, communication staff, and then we've got a broader group of what we call our science network. These are experts in their field, many from academia, but also from the professional world that we work with to help inform our policy positions and help inform what it is we advocate for. I work on the climate and energy team. My work is mostly focused on state regulatory work. That means in the electric sector, a lot of the decision-making processes occur at state utility commissions. And that is where I spend most of my time reviewing these public dockets that utilities come in and they ask their utility commissions to approve certain proposals and certain plans. I review them, write expert testimony, or bring in other experts from our science network to have them write testimony to try to improve that process. So the first thing I want to go over very quickly is to dispel a long-held belief that coal-fired power plants are a base load resource. And so what that means is the way we've generally thought about the electric system and how we provide electricity is through base load, mid-merit, and peaker units. And this is sort of a graphical representation of that. This has been how we've thought about it for decades. And you see that over the course of a day, we have here 5 summer days in, so I've pulled from other presentations. This says illustrated from MISO summer data. MISO is the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator. It's one of the large wholesale competitive market grid operators. It runs from Minnesota and North Dakota all the way down to Louisiana. It's a very large footprint. And this is what a summer day or a series of summer days look like. And over on the second graph, what a series of winter days will look like. And you see base load resources sort of operate all out, all year round, and provide sort of a steady stream of electricity to meet demand. And these other resources fluctuate up and down or turn on and off in order to meet the variability in demand. And that shape changes over the course of the year, but this has been how we've looked at the electric grid for a while. Now, we've usually thought of nuclear and coal as being base load, and gas being the sort of mid-merit, and then oil and gas units being the peakers. But that's really changed dramatically over the past 5 years, maybe 10 years, depending on how you want to look at it. And right now we have to meet electric demand with electric generation every moment. It has to perfectly meet each other because we don't have significant amounts of storage on the grid. Now that's going to change even more as storage becomes more prevalent on the electric grid. But this is how the MISO system actually operates in winter, spring, summer, and fall. And what you can see is, coal resources do fluctuate quite a bit over the course of the year. They don't operate as that base load resource that we typically think of. Nuclear does. Its output is pretty much steady year round and over the course of a day. But coal and gas do fluctuate. And that's a consequence of changing economics, but it's also just a reality that you have to meet demand. And so these resources have to fluctuate and they have to go ramp up and ramp down. So that's important. Oh, actually, you know what? Before I move on, I just wanted to pause really quickly and see if we have any questions. And I'm looking at the chat. I don't see any questions for the first couple of slides. So I'm gonna move forward. And if you do have any questions, feel free to ask them. And when I get to these transition slides, I'll check the webinar chat and see if people have questions. All right. So I mentioned MISO earlier. It's one of 7 large grid operators in the United States. These independent system operators or regional transmission organizations, collectively referred to as ISOs and RTOs, they're really charged with delivering the lowest cost electricity in a reliable manner. And the way they achieve this is through a reverse auction known as merit order marginal pricing, where they put all of the resources on the system and they stack them up from lowest cost to highest cost. And this produces a supply curve. And then depending on what demand is, they will select the resources that are lowest cost but necessary to meet demand. And that marginal resource, the last resource needed to serve demand, sets a clearing price. Now, this achieves a lot of interesting effects. There's a whole game theory behind why the price is set this way. But effectively what happens is lower cost resources make more money, and that encourages for more new low cost resources to enter the market, and that helps keep consumer costs down. And when the markets were built and designed, and these market rules were written, they were really, they had one type of utility in mind, and that was independent power providers. And these are the types of utilities that are entirely reliant on these markets for their revenues. But as wholesale markets became more popular, vertically integrated utilities that operate under rate regulation, they joined these markets. So if you're here in DC or in Maryland, or then your utility is the utility that bills you every month. It buys its electricity from the wholesale market, and that company doesn't own any generation assets. But if you live in Virginia, then your electric utility is probably Dominion, and Dominion not only serves you, but it actually owns the generation assets. So it owns the generation, it owns the distribution, and that's a vertical monopoly. And those utilities utilities like Dominion aren't reliant on the wholesale market for their revenues. They go back to their state regulator and say, here are our costs. They literally, they bring the receipts and they say, these are our costs for the year. And, this is how much we need to charge customers. And that allows them to enter these markets and essentially skip in line, because they can underbid. They don't have to, recover all of their costs in the wholesale market. So if they have a $35 a megawatt hour resource and the market price is $23, well, they don't need to make $23. They're going to make $35 no matter what. And this has a significant effect on the rest of the market. It has two primary immediate impacts. So because electricity is fundamentally a zero-sum game in any given hour, that resource operating deprives some other resource from being called. So some other resource that would have been necessary, that was by definition lower cost, is being deprived revenue because this resource is self-committing. And that's the loophole that they're exploiting, is the markets allow utilities to self-commit resources. And I want to say just now, there are good reasons to self-commit a resource. And one example of that might be that the National Electric Reliability Corporation requires that, NERC, requires that generators test their power plants to make sure they can have meet a certain output for their summer reliability metrics. And so you're going to have to generate out at your maximum output regardless of market price. Now, that makes sense in short, term, in very specific timeframes for short periods of time, and it's not a very frequent event. But now these utilities that are guaranteed to recover the entirety of this orange cost, they can just do it all year round. So that then deprives these other resources, these lower cost resources, from being called. But it also has an effect on the clearing price, because the resource that does clear is slightly less expensive than the resource that would have cleared. And so the market price would have gone up, which means every resource that is getting called is being deprived of some revenues. So you have increased costs because you have this large orange bar that customers then have to pay for, plus everybody else is losing out on money. And so that's sort of the theory of how these markets are being disturbed by this practice of self-commitment. So before I talk about some of the analysis, I'm just going to check the chat. What proof do you have Okay, some of these questions I'm going to get to a little bit later. Okay, so I'm going to get to some of these questions in a little bit because I know I don't see any clarifying questions quite yet. I'm going to keep on moving, but these are good questions. So please do keep them coming. Oh, there we go. Okay, so the history of this research. So the first real public report on this practice I wrote back in 2017 when I was still at the Sierra Club. And it focused on a different market, the Southwest Power Pool, or SPP. And what I did is I looked at the hourly generation of about a dozen coal plants in the Southwest Power Pool and compared their operations and their costs to the revenues that they were getting from the market, and found that for long periods of time, these power plants were operating at a loss. And there were some references to uneconomic self-commitment in some FERC filings and in sort of regulatory dockets, but there hadn't been a real public report on the topic until then. And since then, there's been a series of additional public research that has been presented, including reports written by the Chamber of Commerce, Bloomberg New Energy Finance, and then in 2018, when I came to UCS, I looked at every single coal-fired power plant that operates in an ISO or RTO, and I lined up their hourly generation with their hourly revenues and their costs, and determined that at a national level, there was nearly $1 billion of costs being incurred by these utilities, passed on to ratepayers at times when lower cost resources were available. That analysis was then replicated by Synapse Energy Economics and Sierra Club in their report, Playing with Other People's Money, and they also came up with about $1 billion a year figure. And just at the end of last year, the Southwest Power Pool Market Monitor, partially in response to my earlier report, released a whole paper analyzing the effect of the practice on the market and doing some really robust modeling on what would happen if the practice were stopped, and what options does the market have to help prevent this practice to getting out of hand. And UCS is, we're currently in the finalization process of our report that will be forthcoming, hopefully in late April, early May, entitled "Used but How Useful," and that's some of the analysis that we're going to talk about later. So, the dark spread is what most research has focused on so far. The dark spread is essentially what is the value of coal electricity compared to market price. So here you have the fuel cost of a coal plant, prior to O&M costs. You have the market price at the Minnesota hub, so using a proxy, just looking at Minnesota. And then once you add the O&M costs, the variable O&M costs, I should be specific here, not all of the O&M, just the various costs that are required to burn the fuel. So this might be additional catalyst for a selective catalytic, for nitrogen removal, or sorbent for sulfur removal or mercury removal. And it requires the use of chemicals and water. So it adds to the cost of burning coal. And what you see is that for the most part, for most of the year, the dark spread, or the relative cost to burn coal versus buy electricity, is negative, meaning that if a coal plant is operating in these hours, it's losing between $0 and $15 a megawatt hour. And what I was able to do, and what Sierra Club and Synapse and Bloomberg New Energy Finance did, was line up the hourly dark spread with the hourly generation and quantify the market losses. What UCS's next report is going to say, all right, let's look at the MISO system and let's use the same modeling software that MISO uses to determine which resources will get dispatched. And let's take into account all of the constraints, because coal plants are big, kind of slow-moving pieces of machinery. They are able to follow load to some extent, but they can't just turn on and off. There's a cost to turning them on and off. There's a ramp rate, the speed of which they can turn up and down. Once they get turned off, they can only, they have to wait before they can turn back on. And so what we were able to do is account for all of those constraints and replicate the 2018, what actually happened in 2018, and then remove the must-run constraint, remove the determination of, oh, I'm going to run no matter what the market price is. We left in all of the physical restraints, and then we're able to show, oh, what happens to the grid. And what we found was just like the theory said, market prices go up a little bit, but production costs go down. That there are plenty of other lower cost resources on the MISO grid today, regardless of what would get built, to meet demand, to meet hourly demand on the system with transmission constraints, with physical restraints of the existing resources, and at lower cost. And because market prices go up a little bit, but because we're relying on lower cost, more efficient resources, the resources that get used make more money. And that's market surplus. So that's the relative profitability of resources in that market go up. And it's largely driven by reduction in coal generation. And for those who happen to be, who might be wondering, we only did the modeling where we assumed that only coal plants were changed from the must-run status to economic dispatch. So that that's something I just want to call out here, which is why we saw the reduction in coal. But what our research is also showing is that it impacts the grid on a number of other ways. It's not just the existing resources. The way MISO and most grids do transmission planning is they look at congestion within the transmission system, and they look at price differentials. So if it's, if the average price in northern Missouri is $27 and in southern Missouri is $27, then it doesn't really make sense to build more the price differential alone won't justify building a transmission line because there's no major price differential. But if there's a lot of coal in northern Missouri that's flooding the market and artificially reducing prices, then there might be additional resources in MISO South or in Indiana and Illinois from the north that could come in and provide lower cost energy. But the fact that the market price is being distorted actually prevents that transmission planning and that identification process from happening. It also affects renewables. And the most direct way it affects renewables is that these power plants that don't respond to the market prices won't turn off. So they'll keep on running at some minimum operating level, even though the market price it doesn't justify it, and they'll lose money. And because wind energy can be curtailed so easily, it ends up being wind that gets curtailed instead of coal generation that gets reduced. And if you look at the hours in the year where in MISO or in the Southwest Power Pool, where the market price is negative, there's typically quite a bit of coal generation still operating. And they won't turn it off because it's on this self-commitment status. And so they're forced to curtail wind. There's other ways that it affects renewables and efficiency, and that is because the market price is being artificially suppressed. And so in take, for example, PURPA, which is energy law that was passed in the 70s, which requires utilities to buy renewable energy at a certain price. And a lot of utilities will use the wholesale market price as the value of energy. But if those market prices are artificially low, then the renewable energy developers are getting a low value for their energy. There's a number of other ways that have been brought to my attention of how this affects renewables. I'm not going to get into every single one of them. Happy to dive into more about how it affects renewables in the Q&A session. Similarly, efficiency is typically valued based off of the avoided costs, and market prices are a common proxy for avoided costs. And if those prices are being disturbed, if they're being distorted, then efficiency isn't being properly valued. And then lastly, there's the obvious that these are the most expensive, most least efficient, dirtiest coal plants that are engaged in this practice. And so if you were to have them all be dispatched economically, they would be replaced with something that was more efficient and therefore less polluting. And so there's those carbon emission reductions that you'd see. But if you think about it, if utilities aren't responding to market price signals, right? If they're willing to incur the $30 of fuel costs and operate when the market price is $25, then if there's a carbon price that increases their cost to emit, but they're indifferent to it and they can just pass that cost along to customers, I'm starting to wonder if the efficacy of carbon pricing might be diminished by this practice. And so these are some of the things that UCS is going to be researching and analyzing going forward. So that was a little bit of it was a somewhat lengthy summary of the research past, present, and here you have some of the future research that UCS is looking at. So I'm going to stop real quick to see if there are any clarifying questions. Okay. Again, I'm seeing some really great in the weeds questions. I'm going to jump back to these at the end of the presentation. So lastly, what I want to talk about is how UCS is using this research to stop this practice and to influence the public policy and the decision-making that goes on at the state and regional level. Okay, there we go. So the way most advocacy, the way that many advocates think about how to affect change is through an inside game and an outside game. And when you're talking about energy and electricity, the inside game usually might include something like lobbying, for new laws or new policy, or legal action, suing a utility or intervening in a rate case. And so there's the strategy, and then you have the tactics of the lobbying and the legal action. There's also, the outside game, which is about influencing the decision makers. So that might be organizing a rally or outreach to media and to get news coverage of something. And we can use both of these inside and outside game strategies to address self-committing. So the inside game, which is direct action, that might happen at either the market level, so engaging with the wholesale market directly, with the state regulator, or with legislation. And in the form of the wholesale markets, these are entities that engage in rulemaking procedures. They have technical hearings. They release reports. And so by engaging in those proceedings, writing comments, writing technical reports, you can influence the markets. In the regulatory space, the utilities have to go to the regulators and request certificates of needs or start a resource plan, like an integrated resource plan, or do rate cases where they get, which is where they get their recovery for these costs. And so by intervening in the regulatory process, we can provide expert testimony and say, look, this power plant is operating and its annual fuel costs are 125 million and its annual market revenues are $85 million. It's not even able to recover its fuel costs in the market. You shouldn't allow it to go back to customers and recover that incremental amount of money because that was incurred, imprudently. And then there's, legislative action. And, UCS and our allies have not really engaged at the legislative level on this issue. We've really focused on the markets and the regulatory, but I include that there mostly for completeness. Then there's the outside game. Again, there's like rallies and public events through things like organizing, which again, this topic is a little bit more technical, a little bit more in the weeds. So, not a lot of stop self-committing rallies going on right now. But the media has actually had some really interesting coverage of this topic, in part through, the more trade journals and regional news coverage. But, NPR has covered this story, as then some of the larger publications out of the Midwest where this issue has come, to be framed as coal is preventing renewables from coming on the grid, preventing low cost wind from coming on the grid. It's able to get a little bit of traction. And then I just want to talk a little bit more about the committee. It's been up in a lot of state commission dockets. I think there's about a dozen here on this list, and there's a lot more that we are either currently involved in or planning on getting involved in. And so this is just not meant to be an exhaustive list, but just to be to illustrate that 4 years ago, most of the other technical experts that I talked to were not talking about this issue. It was not it wasn't really fully normalized. But in part, thanks to the media coverage and the sort of constant release of new reports documenting how problematic this issue is, utilities and utility commissions have started to take notice. And in Missouri and in Minnesota, the commissions have actually opened up dedicated investigatory dockets to look at this problem and find solutions. And one of the outcomes of that is in Minnesota, Xcel Energy has said, we're going to stop operating these, our coal plants for 8-9 months of the year. It only makes economic sense to run these units in the summertime when market prices are high enough. And so that's the only time we're going to run them. And you know what? We have coal plants outside of Minnesota, and we're going to think about this strategy in those states as well. And UCS wasn't involved in the New Mexico or Texas cases, but it looks like Xcel Energy is going to move to seasonal operations for those power plants as well. And then here's about, let's see, what is this, 6, 7 blogs that I've written about this topic. It includes some details on potential solutions, the economics of seasonal shutdowns, the impact on the grid. And then we had a really great conversation with some state regulators and with Richard Glick, who's a commissioner at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. We had a panel conversation, and if you click on the how does uneconomic coal generation impact the grid, a discussion with regulators, that has a link to like an hour-long YouTube video where I discussed this issue with some of the regulators. And so, I wanted to try to reserve a lot of time for questions. And I think we've got about 25 minutes remaining if my clock is accurate. I'm now gonna open it up for questions. All right. Sorry, I am going through the chat.
Hi, Joe. Can you hear me okay?
Oh, I can.
All right. Do you want me to, I can ask them to you in order if that helps a little bit.
Sure.
If we can backtrack up to John's question that he started with, as to, and some of these you can already kind of call out if you addressed it, if you feel like you addressed it enough. But he had asked earlier, what proof do we have that the coal industry is getting opportunities, bailouts, et cetera, over clean energy, and how to change the trend among policymakers, energy consumers, et cetera, to take a stronger stance towards clean energy?
Well, John, I hope that I had a chance to address that question in later slides. I realize that you asked this pretty early on. And so, how do we change the?
Yeah, he says you did. Thank you. Okay.
Okay.
Making sure.
Right,
okay. I just wanted to go backtrack a little bit. Okay. We had another question from Famatelia. Is the Wise Country, Virginia City Hybrid Energy Center an example of this? So that must have been in reference to something you were speaking about earlier.
Yeah, I'm wondering if that's probably a specific power plant. I don't, so a couple things. One, I have done the analysis for every coal plant, but I don't have that list in front of me right now. That power plant does not ring a bell in terms of the worst actors. So one of my blogs looked at like the 25 worst coal plants engaging in this practice, and I don't recall that one being in the list of 25. But there are hundreds and hundreds of coal plants, so that one might be an issue. I hesitate to speculate about any individual power plants, though. So the modeling that we're going to release, that the Union of Concerned Scientists is going to release in April or May, will have unit by unit listings of every single power plant in the MISO system, based off of the Virginia City portion of the name for the power plant. I'm going to guess the power plant's in Virginia, which is part of PJM. So I don't know if that will be helpful, but we do plan on providing a list of the economic cost of every single coal plant in MISO.
Okay, and to clarify, she said it is Wise County, not Wise Country, and it is in Virginia. We had a question from Jessica Terry. As you see increased renewable generation, are you anticipating increased ancillary services or ancillary products to maintain reliability?
Yes, I guess is the short answer. In fact, I think there was just a report released by the California Independent System Operator, CAISO, like yesterday. Maybe I just found out about it today. It was released recently, indicating how wind resources in California are providing certain ancillary services that have historically been provided by thermal power plants, so coal and gas and nuclear. So similarly, there was a study recently done by, I think it was like First Solar and then a Florida utility and Energy E3, Energy Environment Economics, I believe is the name of the consulting firm, that looked at various ancillary services that solar can provide. Storage provides a litany of these ancillary services. And so, yes, as these large coal plants come offline, we will need to find ways to provide all of the services that those power plants were providing. But what we found is, because it's not, electricity works like a flip of a switch, but the industry doesn't move that quickly. So we don't turn off. We've learned how to integrate 10% of renewables onto the grid, and once we learned how to do 10%, it made getting to 20 easier. And now, as we realize what we needed to do to get 20, we're learning how to do 30, 40%, and every year we get more renewables on the grid, and we learn more about how to cost effectively integrate it, and we learn more about how to maximize the benefits those resources are providing. So not directly related to this batch of research, but yeah, we are seeing more ancillary services being provided by wind and solar and storage and demand response and flexible demand and other resources. Yeah. Thank you.
She also continues with a second question. So also coming from Jessica Terry, she says, it sounds like you are concluding that deregulation results in more efficient markets, but it's my understanding that deregulated states have higher average cost compared to regulated states. And she puts in parentheses 11.9 cents per kilowatt hour versus 9.6 cents per kilowatt hour in 2018, according to Public Power. How does your analysis address this rate spread in regulated versus deregulated states?
So a couple of things to unpack there. The higher costs, as I understand it, are the residential bill, which is a lot different than the wholesale. So that has to do with any number of other factors, including transmission costs, distribution costs, and also is about the rate and not the bill. And really, electricity, once you start parsing out electricity rates across states, you tend to miss out on what the average bill is. And if you have a utility like Minnesota, like Excel in Minnesota, that has really aggressive energy efficiency standards, they might have a slightly higher rate than the local co-op, but they have a lower bill because of consumers are saving money through energy efficiency. So there's a lot of things you have to control for. Public power and monopoly utilities are the only ones engaging in this practice. That doesn't mean that merchants are better. It just means on this particular issue, those types of utilities are not using their resources, they're not allocating their assets effectively. And so in Michigan right now, one of the monopoly utilities there, one of the investor-owned utilities there is Detroit Edison, so DTE is what it's known as. Now, DTE is going in for a rate hike. They want to increase rates on their customers. And it's for, implementing all sorts of grid modernization technology. That is independent of how they operate their power plants. If they operated their power plants more efficiently, then that's just going to lower that rates. And that would, assuming these numbers are, accurate and controlling for all those variables, that's just going to make that spread even greater. So, I don't think a logical conclusion from my analysis is don't deregulate, don't restructure. And I don't think a logical analysis conclusion from my analysis is restructure just because of this one issue. I think there's a lot of different complicating factors and other variables that you have to weigh when thinking about regulation versus deregulation. And it's neither here or there, but even deregulated utilities are heavily regulated industries. EPA regulates the power plant. FERC regulates the wholesale market. The state regulator still has to regulate the distribution side. So a lot of really great points in there. I'm just not sure I'm not sure you can make a definitive conclusion on this analysis alone about merchant versus rate regulated utilities.
Okay, we've got, let's see, we have another question from Daniel Pertwee. He says each year a number of states become battlegrounds around state NEM policies. A common argument from utilities regulators against NEM is a cost shift from DG customers to non-DG customers. Have you seen any numbers comparing potential rate-based overpayment due to cost shifts from NEM against overpayment due to coal self-scheduling? My expectation is coal self-scheduling costs the rate base more than claimed increases due to cost shifts from state NEM programs.
All right, so thank you very much for this question, Daniel. So NEM, net energy metering, it's a policy that allows a residential customer to put solar panels on their roof and sell excess electricity back onto the grid, and the electricity that you consume is netted against the electricity that you produce, and your bill is netted out. The argument against it is that there is this cost shift, that the net metering customers are being overcompensated. There's two ways, well, there's one primary way that these two issues are connected. And that is that the value that the generation onto the grid, generation onto the grid is typically valued at the wholesale rate, which, as I've mentioned a couple times on this presentation, is being artificially suppressed by the coal plants. So yeah, you're undervaluing the excess generation from net metering facilities because of this practice. But what I think you're asking is, has this cost shift been compared to the self-scheduling and self-committing practice? So I think this is a really interesting way to frame it. I don't believe anybody has given side-by-side comparison numbers. I think your instincts are probably right, though, for a lot of utilities, because we're seeing utilities that are incurring $50, $60, $70, $100 million a year in excess costs as a result of the practice of self-committing. And I don't think there are that many, there's that high of adoption of net metering in many states that would then translate into excess generation, resulting in that amount of cost shift. In fact, and this is not part of this presentation, but this is just my personal opinion on net metering, there was a proceeding in Kansas or Oklahoma or Missouri, I can't remember which state, but it had very low adoption of rooftop solar. And the utility hired an expert witness to testify about this cost shift issue. And they determined that the cost shift over the next 2 years was going to be roughly $350,000. And to which the lawyer then asked, what is your hourly billing rate and how many hours did you work on that calculation? And the amount that the consultant charged the utility to do that calculation was $370,000. So actually more than the total cost shift, which just gives you an indication of quantifying the extent of the problem is actually more costly than the proposed problem. So at really low adoption rates, probably not actually an issue. But there are these other sort of hidden cost shifts that aren't talked about, like self-committing, that are a huge problem. And I think there's an irony that utilities want other people's resources to be valued at an artificially low number, and they want their resources to be valued at an artificially high value. And it does really play into this notion of utility ownership that we were talking about earlier. The fundamental problem of rate regulation, whether it's at an IOU or a public utility, is that they get cost recovery, and that's fine if you have really meticulous oversight by regulators. And if you don't, then the utilities will allow to pass those costs along to customers. But if you have really good oversight, and you have energy regulators that are willing to scrutinize and push back on the utilities practices, then the customers are really going to be the ones to benefit. And I think we've seen that happening in Minnesota. I think we're seeing that in Missouri, and I think we're going to see that in more and more states, that as analysts, many of you, I hope, are aspiring to become analysts, and as you do your work and as you enter into the field, this is, if you approach it with the mind of not just markets work perfectly, but more that markets paired with strong regulations, working in concert with oversight and with close scrutiny, then that's really where you're going to get the most ideal outcomes. And I just saw that Peter chimed in, and hey, Peter, great hearing from you, and glad to see that this will be added to your policy course this summer.
It looks like you got one more question from Daniel. In any of the resources you shared today, do you break out estimated overpayment by retail customers due to coal self-scheduling by state? He'd love to compare this more to NEM policies in certain states.
I don't know if we've broken it down to the state level yet. Yeah, I don't recall that particular. Yeah, I don't think so. So there's preponderance of data, and there's a lot of different permutations for how to display it. I do think in our forthcoming report, we'll have the breakdown by average customer by state. So your average monthly bill is $5 too high because of this practice. So that'll be, we'll have that number. And then we'll have the gross aggregate by MISO zone. So there's 10 zones in MISO. These are capacity zones. And we've got the numbers broken down at that level. So there's different permutations that will be presented. But it sounds like there'll be plenty for you to chew on come end of April, early May, when the report gets released.
And at this point, it looks like that is all of our questions. I want to thank you for a wonderful presentation.